Thornwood estate sat at the edge of Briar Hollow, like a monument to something best forgotten. 3 stories of weathered brick and iron, windows that reflected nothing but grey sky, and gardens that had long surrendered to wild growth. It was October 1896, and the house had stood for nearly 200 years, watching over the small Massachusetts town with the patience of something that knew it would outlast them all. Eleanor Thornwood was 6 years old, with dark hair that her mother braided each morning, and eyes that seemed too old for her small face. She sat at the breakfast table that morning, picking at her oatmeal while her parents spoke in low voices at the other end of the long dining room. Her older brother James had turned 7 3 months ago. He had not been the same since his night in the mausoleum. James used to laugh. He used to chase Eleanor through the gardens and tell her stories about dragons and brave knights. Now he sat silent at meals, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on something no one else could see. When Eleanor asked him what happened that night, he only looked at her with those empty eyes and said nothing at all. Their father, William Thornwood, was a tall man with greying hair and the kind of stern face that never quite smiled. He owned the textile mill that kept Briar Hollow alive, employed half the town, and carried himself with the authority of someone who had never been told no. That morning, he folded his newspaper with precise movements and cleared his throat. "Eleanor will turn 7 in the spring," he said to his wife Margaret, as if Eleanor were not sitting right there. "We should begin preparing her." Margaret Thornwood was a beautiful woman who had learned to hide her feelings behind perfect posture and pleasant smiles. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. "She's still so young, William. I was 7, you were 7. James completed the tradition. Eleanor will do the same." His tone allowed no argument. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had always known this day would come. Every Thornwood child knew. But knowing and facing it were different things entirely. The town of Briar Hollow knew about the Thornwood tradition, though no one spoke of it openly. The mausoleum stood on a hill behind the estate, visible from the main road, a small stone building with iron gates and the family name carved above the entrance. Local children dared each other to approach it at night, but never did. The adults simply looked away when they passed, as if acknowledging it might invite something unwanted into their lives. Dr. Samuel Harrison was one of the few who had ever questioned the tradition aloud. He had moved to Briar Hollow 5 years earlier, a young physician fresh from Boston Medical School, full of modern ideas and progressive thinking. He had attended to James after his night in the mausoleum, examined the boy's racing pulse and dilated pupils, and asked William Thornwood directly what purpose this barbaric custom served. William had looked at him with those cold eyes and said simply, "It keeps them safe." "Safe from what?" Dr. Harrison had asked, but William Thornwood had already turned away, the conversation over. Now, as Eleanor sat at that breakfast table, she thought about safety. She thought about James, who no longer seemed safe at all, but rather like someone who had seen something that hollowed him out from the inside. She thought about the stories the housemaid Mary whispered when she thought no one was listening, about Thornwood children from generations past who had emerged from that mausoleum, changed, marked, different. Her father rose from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I have business at the mill," he announced. He paused beside Eleanor's chair, placing one heavy hand on her shoulder. "You are a Thornwood, Eleanor. When your time comes, you will be brave." But Eleanor did not feel brave. She felt small and afraid, and when her father left the room, she looked at her mother with desperate hope that Margaret might say something, anything that would make this different. Her mother only looked back with sad eyes and said nothing at all. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out 3 times. Eleanor counted each cry the way children count to ward off bad luck, and wondered if luck had anything to do with what awaited her in that stone building on the hill. Winter came to Briar Hollow like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Snow piled against the Thornwood estate, and ice formed intricate patterns on the windows that Eleanor traced with her finger, while James sat motionless in his chair by the fire. The silence between them had become its own presence, heavy and cold. Margaret tried to maintain normalcy. She organized afternoon teas with the other society women of Briar Hollow, women who wore expensive dresses and spoke of trivial matters while carefully avoiding any mention of the Thornwood tradition. They admired Margaret's china and complimented her flower arrangements, and everyone pretended not to notice when James walked through the room like a ghost, acknowledging no one. Eleanor spent her days under the supervision of Miss Abigail Stone, her governess, a thin woman in her 50s who taught reading, arithmetic, and deportment with mechanical efficiency. Miss Stone had been governess to Thornwood children for 30 years. She had taught William himself, and before him his father. She never spoke of the tradition, but Eleanor sometimes caught her looking at the children with something that might have been pity. "The capital of New York is Albany," Miss Stone recited that grey December afternoon. "Repeat after me, Eleanor." But Eleanor was not thinking about capitals. She was thinking about the mausoleum, about what waited inside. "Miss Stone," she asked quietly, "what happens in there?" The governess's hand froze above her lesson book. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "We do not discuss such things, child." "But you know, don't you? You've taught all of us, you've seen what we become." Miss Stone closed her book with a sharp snap. "That is quite enough, Eleanor. You will learn your capitals." That night, Eleanor did something she had never dared before. She waited until the house fell silent, until the servants retired and her parents closed their bedroom door, and then she crept down the hallway to James's room. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold floor. James sat up in bed, awake, staring at the wall. He was always awake now. Their mother worried about it, gave him warm milk before bed, but nothing helped. Whatever sleep he managed was restless and brief. "James," Eleanor whispered from the doorway, "please talk to me." Her brother's head turned slowly. In the moonlight filtering through his window, his face looked hollow, older than his 7 years. "You should go back to bed, Ellie." "I need to know what happens. Mother and father won't tell me. No one will tell me." James was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, his voice flat and distant. "You'll see them." "See who?" "All of them. Everyone who came before. Everyone who's been in there." He turned his gaze back to the wall. "They're waiting, Ellie. They're always waiting." Eleanor felt ice spread through her chest. Are they ghosts?" "I don't know what they are." James's hands gripped his blanket. "They look like us. They sound like us. But they're not really there. Not the way we're here. And they want something." "What do they want?" James looked at her again, and this time there was something in his eyes that terrified her more than his emptiness had. Fear. Real, raw fear. "They want to remember what it felt like, to be alive, to be warm, to be real. And for one night, they get to feel it again through us, through our fear." Eleanor backed away from the door, her heart pounding. "That's not real. That can't be real." "You asked." James lay back down, turning his face to the wall. "You'll understand in the spring. You'll understand everything." Eleanor ran back to her room and climbed into bed, pulling her covers tight around her. But she could not stop shaking, could not stop thinking about what James had said. The dead reaching out through the living. The price of being a Thornwood. The next morning, she found her father in his study, surrounded by ledgers and papers from the mill. She stood in the doorway, gathering her courage. "Father, I don't want to do it. The tradition. Please don't make me." William Thornwood did not look up from his work. "Every Thornwood does it, Eleanor, without exception." "But why? What purpose does it serve?" Now he did look at her, and his expression was harder than stone. "Our family has thrived for 2 centuries while others have fallen. The mill prospers while others fail. Briar Hollow itself exists because we exist. That is the purpose. That is the price." He returned to his ledgers. "You will do your duty when the time comes. This discussion is over." Eleanor wanted to scream, to cry, to run. But she was a Thornwood, and Thornwoods did not show such weakness. She curtsied properly and left the study, her hands clenched into fists. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering everything in white. Eleanor pressed her face against the cold window glass and looked up at the mausoleum on the hill. Even from this distance, even through the snow, she could see it clearly. Waiting, always waiting. Spring was coming, and with it, her 7th birthday. February brought a thaw to Briar Hollow, and with it a visitor. Dr. Harrison's niece arrived from Boston to stay with her uncle for an extended visit. Her name was Catherine, and she was 9 years old with red hair and freckles, and absolutely no understanding of the unspoken rules that governed the town. Eleanor met her at church on Sunday. The Thornwoods sat in their customary pew at the front, a position of honor that felt more like display. Catherine and her uncle sat 3 rows back, and Catherine spent the entire sermon staring openly at James, who sat motionless as always, his eyes fixed on something beyond the altar. After the service, as families gathered in the churchyard for polite conversation, Catherine walked directly up to Eleanor. "Why doesn't your brother talk? Is he simple?" Margaret Thornwood inhaled sharply. Several nearby conversations stopped. No one spoke to the Thornwoods this way, no one questioned, no one pried. But Eleanor felt something unexpected, relief. Here was someone who did not know, who did not pretend, who simply asked. "No," Eleanor said quietly. "He's not simple, he's just different now." "Different how?" Catherine's curiosity was genuine, without malice. "Catherine," Dr. Harrison called, his voice tight with embarrassment. "Come here, please." But Catherine ignored him, still looking at Eleanor with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Something happened to him, didn't it? Something bad. Eleanor nodded slowly. Around them, the adults had resumed their conversations, but Eleanor could feel their attention, their disapproval. She lowered her voice. "Can you keep a secret? Always. Meet me at the iron gates by the town square tomorrow afternoon. I'll tell you everything." The next day, Eleanor slipped away from Miss Stone during what should have been her music lesson. The governess had fallen asleep in her chair, as she often did after lunch, and Eleanor had learned to move silently through the house. She wore her plainest dress and a heavy cloak, trying to look unremarkable as she hurried through Briar Hollow's streets. Catherine was already waiting, bundled against the cold wind. "Your governess knows you left?" "Not yet." Eleanor glanced around to ensure no one was watching. "Walk with me." They headed toward the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the woods began. Eleanor had never told anyone about the tradition, never spoken the fear that lived constantly in her chest. But something about Catherine's directness, her outsider status, made the words pour out. She told her about the mausoleum, about every Thornwood child's 7th birthday, about James and how he had changed. She told her about the fear that grew stronger each day as spring approached, as her own 7th birthday drew near. Catherine listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious. When Eleanor finished, Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's not tradition, that's torture." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. No one had ever said it so plainly. "My father says it keeps us safe, that it's the price of our prosperity." "Safe from what? And who decided children should pay this price?" Catherine's voice was fierce. "My uncle is a doctor. He knows about the mind, about trauma. What you're describing is trauma, Eleanor, deliberately inflicted trauma. But everyone does it. Everyone survives it. Surviving isn't the same as being unharmed." Catherine grabbed Eleanor's hands. "My uncle questions things. He believes in science and reason, not superstition. Maybe he can help." Eleanor pulled away, frightened now. "No, you can't tell him. You can't tell anyone. If my father found out I spoke of this—" She could not finish the sentence, but the fear was real. William Thornwood did not tolerate disobedience. "Then what? You just accept it? You walk into that building and let whatever happens happen?" "I don't have a choice." Catherine's jaw set with determination. "There's always a choice. We just have to find it." Over the next weeks, Catherine became Eleanor's first real friend. They met secretly, carefully, always with excuses ready if questioned. Catherine brought books from her uncle's library, medical texts and journals about the human mind, about fear and its effects. She was convinced that understanding the tradition might reveal a way to break it. "Your brother mentioned seeing the dead," Catherine said one afternoon, as they sat hidden in the Thornwood Gardens' old gazebo. "But what if they're not really dead? What if it's something else? A drug, maybe, or some kind of hypnosis that makes you see things?" Eleanor wanted to believe in such rational explanations, but she had seen James's eyes. Whatever he had experienced felt more real than any drug or trick. It's been happening for 200 years, Catherine, generation after generation. If there was a simple explanation, someone would have found it. Or maybe everyone was too afraid to look. Catherine pulled out a small notebook where she had been recording everything Eleanor told her. Your family has power in this town, real power. What if the tradition is how they maintain it? What if it's about control, not protection? The idea was radical, dangerous, but it planted itself in Eleanor's mind like a seed. She began to watch her father differently, to notice how people in town deferred to him, how they never quite met his eyes. She noticed how the mill workers touched their caps when he passed, how shopkeepers gave the Thornwoods the best cuts of meat, the freshest bread. Fear mixed with respect, and maybe respect was just another word for fear. March arrived, bringing rain and mud, and the first hints of spring. Eleanor's birthday was in April. 6 weeks away, then 5, then 4. The countdown had become a physical weight she carried everywhere. One evening, Eleanor overheard her parents arguing behind the closed door of her father's study. She pressed her ear against the wood, barely breathing. She's terrified, William. Her mother's voice was pleading. More terrified than James was. Perhaps we could wait another year, let her be 8 instead of 7. The tradition specifies 7. It has always been 7. Her father's tone was immovable. Margaret, your sentimentality serves no purpose. Eleanor will complete the ritual like every Thornwood before her. But what if something goes wrong? What if she doesn't recover as James did? James is fine, or James is not fine, her mother's voice cracked. He barely eats, barely sleeps. He's a shadow of the boy he was. And you want to do the same to Eleanor? A long silence. Then, quietly, coldly, would you prefer we lose everything? The mill, this house, our position. That is what failure means, Margaret. That is what refusing the tradition means. Ruin. Eleanor stepped away from the door, her heart pounding. So that was it. The price of their wealth, their status, paid in the currency of children's fear. And she was the next payment due. April came soft and green to Briar Hollow, with flowers blooming and birds singing, as if the world were not about to end. Eleanor's 7th birthday fell on a Tuesday, but the tradition required the ritual to take place on the following Saturday night, when the moon would be full. Her mother planned a small birthday celebration for Tuesday afternoon, with cake and presents, and the pretense of normalcy that fooled no one. Catherine attended, one of only 3 guests. The other 2 were cousins from Boston, whom Eleanor barely knew, children of her father's business associates, brought to witness Thornwood propriety. They ate cake in the formal parlor, while adults stood nearby making careful conversation that avoided the one topic that filled every mind. Catherine pulled Eleanor aside when no one was watching. "I've been researching your family," she whispered. "At the town records office, Eleanor, there are inconsistencies." "What do you mean?" "Not every Thornwood child who entered that mausoleum came out." Catherine's voice was urgent, low. "The records are incomplete, deliberately vague. But I found burial records for 3 children who died on or near their 7th birthdays. The causes of death are listed as accidents or illness, but the dates are suspicious." Eleanor felt the room tilt. "My father said everyone survives it. He lied. Or maybe he doesn't know. Maybe the family hides its failures." Catherine gripped her arm. "You can't go in there, Eleanor. We have to find another way." But what other way was there? Eleanor had no power, no money of her own, nowhere to run. She was 7 years old, and the entire weight of her family's history pressed down on her shoulders. That night, she tried one last time to reach her brother. James sat in his usual chair by the window, staring out at the darkness. Eleanor knelt beside him. "James, please, help me. Tell me how to survive it." James turned his hollow eyes to her. For a moment, she thought he would refuse to speak, as he so often did. But then slowly he reached out and took her hand. His fingers were cold. "Don't fight them," he said softly. "That's what I did wrong. I fought and screamed and tried to run. But there's nowhere to run in there. They're everywhere." "Then what should I do?" "Listen to them. Let them tell their stories. They've been waiting so long to be heard. His grip tightened. And when it's over, when you come out, remember that you're still you. That's the hardest part, Ellie. Remembering who you were before. I forgot. I let them take too much. Eleanor threw her arms around her brother, and for the first time in months, James hugged her back. She felt him trembling, or perhaps she was the one trembling. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know. So was I." He pulled back, meeting her eyes. "But you're braver than me, Ellie. You've always been braver. Maybe you'll find a way I couldn't." Saturday arrived cold and overcast, clouds hiding the promised full moon. Eleanor spent the day in a daze, barely eating the meals placed before her, barely responding when spoken to. Her mother dressed her in a simple white nightgown, the same one every Thornwood child wore for the ritual, plain cotton that had been washed and stored and worn by generations. As sunset approached, her father came to her room. He carried a lantern and wore his most formal suit, as if this were a business appointment, rather than the night his daughter would be locked in a tomb with whatever waited there. "It's time," he said simply. The walk to the mausoleum felt both endless and too short. Her mother held one hand, her father the other, and James walked behind them. No one spoke. The only sounds were footsteps on the gravel path and the wind through the trees. The mausoleum stood on its hill, stone walls dark against the cloudy sky. Iron gates stood open like a mouth. Above the entrance, the Thornwood name was carved deep, along with a phrase in Latin that Eleanor had never learned to translate. Inside the building was a single room, perhaps 20 feet square. Stone shelves lined the walls, holding coffins of various ages, some ancient and crumbling, others newer. In the center of the room sat a simple wooden chair. Nothing else. No windows except for small ventilation slits near the ceiling. No door on the inside, just the iron gates that would be locked from outside. William Thornwood set the lantern on the floor beside the chair. "You will sit here until dawn. Do not leave the chair. Do not try to open the gates. At first light, I will return and release you." He paused, and for just a moment something that might have been regret crossed his face. "This has been done for 200 years, Eleanor. You will survive it as we all have." Margaret kissed Eleanor's forehead, her tears falling onto Eleanor's cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, my darling girl." Then they were leaving, all of them, and Eleanor stood alone in the center of the mausoleum. She heard the iron gates swing shut with a hollow clang. She heard the lock click into place. She heard footsteps retreating down the hill, and then she heard nothing at all but her own breathing and the frantic beating of her heart. Eleanor sat in the chair as instructed, her hands gripped tight on the armrests. The lantern provided a small circle of light, but the corners of the mausoleum remained deep in shadow. She told herself she would be brave. She told herself it was just one night. She told herself that whatever James had experienced, she would endure it as he had. But as full darkness fell and the last light faded from the ventilation slits, Eleanor realized that telling herself these things and believing them were not the same at all. The shadows in the corners grew deeper, seemed to move and shift. The air grew colder, so cold she could see her breath, though it was April and the night outside was mild. And then from the darkness beyond the lantern's light, she heard a voice, small, young, unmistakably the voice of a child. "Hello," it said. "We've been waiting for you." Eleanor opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her worst fears were beginning, and the night had only just started. Eleanor's scream finally broke free, echoing off the stone walls and ceiling, bouncing back at her from every direction. She pressed herself against the chair, her small body rigid with terror, eyes searching the darkness for the source of that voice. "Please don't scream," the child's voice said again, closer now. "It hurts our ears. We're not used to loud sounds anymore." Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the shadows, not walking exactly, but materializing, like fog condensing into form. Children, dozens of them. They wore clothes from different eras, some in styles Eleanor recognized from portraits in her house, others in fashions so old she could barely comprehend them. Colonial dress, Victorian mourning clothes, simple homespun from centuries past. All children, all around her age when they had died. The closest one was a girl in a dress from perhaps 50 years earlier, with long dark hair and eyes that reflected the lantern light strangely, too bright, too aware. "I'm Nathaniel's sister," she said. "I was Charlotte Thornwood. I came here in 1845. Eleanor's voice shook. "You're dead." "Yes." Charlotte tilted her head. "We're all dead. But one night a year when a new child comes, we get to remember what it felt like. To be seen, to be heard, to matter to someone living." More children pressed closer, forming a circle around Eleanor's chair. A boy in Revolutionary War-era clothing, twin girls in matching pinafores, a teenage boy who looked almost solid, more real than the others. They all watched her with that same too bright gaze, hungry and desperate and sad. "We won't hurt you," Charlotte said. "We can't really. We're not substantial enough, but we need you to listen. That's all we ask. One night of listening, and then you can go." Eleanor thought of James's words. Don't fight them, let them tell their stories. Her heart was still racing, her hands still trembling. But she forced herself to breathe. "What do you want me to hear?" Charlotte smiled, and it was a terrible thing, that smile, full of longing and loss. Everything. How we lived, how we died, how we were forgotten. She gestured to the coffins lining the walls. "Most of us don't even have names on our shelves anymore. The stones have worn away. But we remember. We always remember." And so they spoke. One after another, the dead children of the Thornwood family told Eleanor their stories. Charlotte had died of scarlet fever, burning with fever in this very room where her family had placed her during the ritual, too sick to complete it, but forced to try anyway. The Revolutionary boy, whose name was Thomas, had been killed in an accident at the original mill, crushed by machinery when his father brought him to work at age 7, dead before his ritual night could come. The twin girls, Rebecca and Ruth, whispered their story together, their voices overlapping. They had drowned in the river that ran through Briar Hollow, a spring flood that caught them on their way to school. The teenage boy Marcus was the most recent death, only 20 years past. He had completed his ritual, but had never recovered from it, growing increasingly unstable until, at 15, he had walked into the winter woods and never returned. They found his body in spring. On they spoke, and Eleanor listened. The night deepened. The lantern burned lower. The cold seeped into her bones, but she did not move from the chair. Some of the stories were tragic accidents. Others were darker. Neglect, abuse, the casual cruelty of adults who valued wealth and status over the well-being of their children. The tradition didn't start as protection, Charlotte explained during a lull. It started as punishment. The first William Thornwood built his fortune on the backs of workers he treated worse than animals. When his own son questioned him, challenged him, he locked the boy in here for a night to teach him obedience. The boy survived but was changed, broken into someone who would never question again. "And it worked so well," Thomas added bitterly, "that William made it tradition. Every generation, breaking their children just enough to ensure compliance. The prosperity came from the mill, from exploitation and shrewd business. But the family convinced themselves it was the ritual, that their wealth was supernatural reward for their sacrifice." Eleanor felt sick. "So there's no magic? No curse?" "Oh, there's magic," Marcus said, his voice deeper than the others. "Just not the kind your father thinks. The magic is in what trauma does to a child, how it shapes them, makes them obedient, quiet, afraid to challenge authority. Every Thornwood child who survives this night learns the same lesson, that their parents will sacrifice them for wealth and power, and children who learn that young grow into adults who perpetuate the same cycle." "But some of you died," Eleanor whispered. "The ritual killed you." "Accidents," Charlotte said. "Bad timing, a weak heart, illness no one knew about. The family hides those deaths, calls them something else because admitting the truth would mean admitting the tradition is dangerous, admitting it might not be worth the cost." The lantern flickered. Eleanor watched the flame dance, thinking about everything she had heard, thinking about her father's cold determination, her mother's helpless tears, James's hollow eyes, thinking about the choice that wasn't really a choice, the tradition that was really a tool of control. "What happens now?" she asked the assembled dead. Now, Charlotte said gently, you survive until dawn, and then you decide what kind of Thornwood you're going to be, the kind who perpetuates this for your own children, or the kind who ends it. Eleanor looked at the ring of ghostly faces, at the children who had paid the ultimate price for their family's prosperity, and in that moment, sitting in that cold tomb surrounded by the dead, 7-year-old Eleanor Thornwood made a decision that would change everything. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. The dead children did not vanish after sharing their stories, but remained, sitting on the stone floor around Eleanor's chair, sometimes talking softly among themselves, sometimes falling into long silences. Eleanor learned that they could not leave the mausoleum. Not really. They were bound here, to this place where their bodies rested, or where they had experienced their trauma. One night a year, when a living Thornwood child entered, they became almost solid, almost real. The rest of the time they were whispers and shadows, barely aware. It's lonely, little Rebecca said, leaning against her twin sister. Most of the time, we can't even talk to each other. We just drift. But tonight, because you're here, we're together again. We're real again. That's why we wait for these nights, even though they remind us of everything we lost. Eleanor had stopped shaking from fear, though the cold remained. In its place came something else, anger, clear, bright anger at the adults who had created this tradition, who maintained it, who locked their own children in crypts and called it honor. How many living Thornwoods know the truth? She asked Charlotte. Your father knows something's wrong. He'd have to be blind not to. But he tells himself the lie because the alternative is admitting he's a monster. Charlotte's expression was sad. Most of them convince themselves it's necessary, that the prosperity is real, that without the ritual, everything would collapse. It's easier to believe that than to face what they're really doing. My mother knows it's wrong, Eleanor said quietly. She tried to stop it, but not hard enough. Marcus's voice was harsh. None of them try hard enough because in the end they value their comfortable lives more than they value their children's well-being. That's the real tradition. That's what's really being passed down. The lantern was burning very low now. Eleanor guessed it must be past midnight, maybe approaching the early morning hours. Her body ached from sitting so long in the hard chair. She was desperately hungry and thirsty, though she had been told not to bring food or water. This too was part of the ritual, the deprivation, the discomfort, the grinding misery of the long night. Tell me about the ones who survived, Eleanor asked. The ones like James, like my father. What happened to them? Thomas stood and began pacing, his form flickering slightly as he moved. Some broke completely, like James seems to have. They lose something essential, become shadows of themselves. Others build walls, become hard and cold. Your father is like that. He survived by shutting down his emotions, by convincing himself that what happened to him was right and necessary. And now he does the same to his own children. And some, Charlotte added softly, find ways to cope. They have nightmares for years. They develop rituals of their own to feel safe. They're never quite whole again, but they function. They marry and have children and perpetuate the tradition because they don't know how to break free. I know how, Eleanor said suddenly. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a place of clarity and determination she hadn't known she possessed. I'm going to tell everyone. Not just my family, the whole town. I'm going to stand up in church and tell them what really happens in here, what this tradition really is. The dead children looked at each other. Charlotte shook her head slowly. They won't believe you, Eleanor. You're 7 years old. They'll say you're traumatized, confused. They'll say the ritual affected your mind. Your father will silence you one way or another. Then I'll wait, Eleanor said fiercely. I'll grow up. I'll get older, stronger. And when I'm old enough that they have to listen, I'll tell them everything. I'll make them see. And if they still don't listen... Eleanor thought about this. She thought about her brother, about all the future Thornwood children who would face this night if nothing changed. Then I'll make sure I never have children. I'll be the last Thornwood. I'll let the family line die with me. Marcus laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. Now that would be a rebellion worth watching. The girl who ended a dynasty. It's not a dynasty, Eleanor shot back. It's a cycle of abuse dressed up in fancy words, and cycles can be broken. Charlotte knelt beside Eleanor's chair, her ghostly hand hovering near Eleanor's, but not quite touching. If you mean that, truly mean it, then remember this feeling, remember this anger. Don't let them convince you later that you were wrong or confused, or that the tradition is somehow sacred. Hold on to this truth you've learned tonight. I will, Eleanor promised. I swear it. The lantern flame guttered and nearly died, then steadied. Outside, through the tiny ventilation slits, Eleanor thought she detected the first hint of dawn. The sky changing from black to deep blue. The dead children noticed it too. They began to fade, their forms growing translucent, their voices softer. It's almost time, Charlotte said, her voice barely audible now. Eleanor, thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing us. Most children who come here are too frightened to really hear our stories. But you listened, you cared. I'll remember you, Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face now. All of you. I'll remember your names and your stories. You won't be forgotten. Then maybe, Charlotte whispered as she faded to nothing, we can finally rest. One by one, the dead children vanished. Rebecca and Ruth disappeared hand in hand. Thomas gave Eleanor a solemn nod before dissolving into mist. Marcus lingered longest, his eyes locked on Eleanor's. End it, he said. For all of us who couldn't end it. And then Eleanor was alone in the mausoleum, sitting in her wooden chair, the lantern reduced to a tiny flame. But she was not the same girl who had entered the night before. That girl had been frightened and powerless. This girl, the one who had survived the night and learned the truth, was something else entirely. This girl was dangerous. This girl was determined. This girl would not forget. Outside, the sky lightened to grey. Birds began their morning songs. And Eleanor sat perfectly still in her chair, waiting for her father to unlock the gates, already planning her future, already preparing for the long game of bringing down the Thornwood tradition once and for all. The sound of the lock clicking open seemed impossibly loud in the morning quiet. Eleanor had been awake all night, but she felt no tiredness, only a strange clarity. The iron gates swung open, and William Thornwood stood silhouetted against the dawn, his face anxious in a way Eleanor had never seen before. Behind him, Margaret clutched her shawl around her shoulders, her eyes red from crying. "Eleanor," her father said, his voice rough. "Are you well? Can you stand?" Eleanor stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long. She walked toward them with measured steps, and she saw the moment they registered that something was different. She was not crying, she was not shaking. She met her father's eyes directly, without fear. "I'm well," she said calmly. "I survived." Margaret rushed forward and pulled Eleanor into her arms, sobbing with relief. "Oh, thank God, thank God. My darling girl, you're safe now. It's over." But Eleanor did not return the embrace. She stood rigid in her mother's arms, looking at her father over Margaret's shoulder. "It's not over," she said. "It's never over, is it? Not for James. Not for any of us." William's expression shuttered. "You're in shock, that's normal. Come inside, you need food and rest." They walked back to the house in silence. James was waiting in the front hall, and when he saw Eleanor, something flickered in his eyes. Hope, perhaps, or recognition. He knew. He understood that Eleanor had crossed the same threshold he had seen what he had seen. The household had prepared a special breakfast, as was tradition after the ritual. Eggs and bacon and fresh bread, orange juice and hot coffee. Eleanor sat at the table and ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Her parents watched her carefully, speaking in low tones to each other, clearly unsure what to make of her composure. "Eleanor," her father finally said, "you must not speak of what you experienced last night. Not to your friends. Not to anyone outside this family. Do you understand?" Eleanor looked at him and saw him clearly for the first time, saw the fear beneath his authority, the guilt he worked so hard to suppress. "I understand," she said, which was true. She understood everything now. Dr. Harrison came to examine her that afternoon at Margaret's insistence. He checked her pulse and her eyes, asked her questions about her memory and her feelings. Catherine had come with him and stood in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "Physically, she seems unharmed," Dr. Harrison told Eleanor's parents, "but I want to monitor her over the coming weeks. Sometimes the psychological effects of trauma take time to manifest. When the adults stepped into the hallway to speak privately, Catherine rushed to Eleanor's bedside. "What happened?" she whispered urgently. "Are you all right? You look so strange." "I'm better than all right," Eleanor said quietly. "I know the truth now, Catherine, about everything, and I'm going to end this." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I will." Eleanor gripped her friend's hand. "Will you help me?" Catherine nodded without hesitation. "Always." The days that followed were strange. Eleanor went through the motions of normal life, lessons with Miss Stone, meals with her family, walks in the garden, but everything felt distant, unreal. The only person who seemed to understand was James. They began spending more time together, sitting in companionable silence, not needing to speak about what they shared. One afternoon, James finally broke their silence. "You met them, didn't you, the dead ones?" "Yes." "Did they tell you why? Why the tradition exists?" Eleanor told him everything, about the true origin of the ritual, about the control and the lies, about the children who had died. James listened with growing horror and then, unexpectedly, with anger. It was the first real emotion Eleanor had seen from him in months. "We have to stop it," James said fiercely, "before they do this to anyone else, before they have more children and the cycle continues." "I know, but we're children. They won't listen to us." "Then we make them listen." James stood and began pacing, energy returning to his movements. "We document everything. We write down every story you heard, every death that was covered up. We gather evidence, and when we're old enough, strong enough, we expose it all." Eleanor felt hope kindle in her chest. She was not alone in this. James, damaged as he was still her brother, still brave enough to fight. It could take years. "Then we take years." James met her eyes. "We're Thornwoods. We're supposed to be powerful. Let's use that power for something good instead of perpetuating this nightmare." They began that very day. James had a journal where he had written his own experiences from his ritual night, fragments and nightmares he had tried to process. Eleanor added her own account, writing down every story the dead children had told her. They hid the journal in a loose floorboard in James's room, a secret archive of truth. Catherine became their ally and co-conspirator. She used her uncle's access to town records to copy information about Thornwood deaths that seemed suspicious. She interviewed older residents of Briar Hollow, asking innocent-seeming questions about the Thornwood family's history, piecing together patterns of trauma and silence that stretched back generations. William Thornwood noticed the change in his children. Eleanor and James were no longer isolated, no longer broken. They spent hours together, talking and planning. It worried him, though he could not articulate why. He increased his control in other ways, becoming stricter about their schedules, monitoring their activities more closely. But he could not monitor everything. Children are clever, and determined children even more so. Eleanor and James and Catherine worked their conspiracy in the gaps, in the overlooked moments, in the spaces adults did not think to watch. Spring turned to summer. Eleanor's mother began planning a small party for Eleanor's 8th birthday, desperate to establish normalcy. But Eleanor no longer cared about parties or presents. She cared only about justice, about truth, about ensuring that no other Thornwood child would ever face what she and James had endured. One evening, as the family sat at dinner, William made an announcement. "I've been giving thought to the future. Eleanor, when you're older, perhaps 16 or 17, I'll arrange a good marriage for you. Someone from a respected family, someone who understands our traditions." Eleanor set down her fork carefully. "I won't marry, and I won't have children." The silence that followed was absolute. William's face darkened. "Don't be ridiculous. Of course you'll marry. You're a Thornwood." "Exactly," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "I'm a Thornwood, which means I know what you'll do to my children, and I won't let that happen. The line ends with me." Margaret gasped. William stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "You will do as you're told. You're a child. You don't make such decisions." "I'm not a child anymore." Eleanor stood as well, meeting her father's fury without flinching. "You saw to that when you locked me in that mausoleum. You wanted to break me, to make me obedient. You failed." William raised his hand as if to strike her, but James moved faster, stepping between them. "Touch her, and I'll tell everyone," James said quietly. "Every sordid detail of what you do to your children. I'll stand in the middle of town and scream it until everyone hears." Father and son stared at each other. Finally, William lowered his hand. "Get out of my sight," he said coldly. "Both of you." Eleanor and James left the dining room together. As they climbed the stairs, James whispered, "It started. The real fight. Are you ready?" Eleanor thought about the dead children in the mausoleum, about Charlotte and Thomas and Marcus and all the others, about the promise she had made them. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's end this." The summer of 1896 became a turning point for Briar Hollow, though most of its residents would not understand why until much later. Eleanor and James Thornwood became inseparable, working with Catherine Harrison to build their case against the family tradition. They compiled testimonies, documented patterns, gathered every scrap of evidence they could find. William Thornwood grew increasingly agitated. His children's rebellion went against everything the tradition was supposed to create. They should have been compliant, broken, obedient. Instead, they were united and defiant. He tried different tactics, threats, bribes, appealing to family loyalty. Nothing worked. In August, tragedy struck in a way no one anticipated. William Thornwood collapsed at the mill, a sudden failure of his heart. Dr. Harrison was called but could do nothing. By sunset, William was dead at 45 years old, leaving his family in chaos. The funeral was a grand affair, befitting Briar Hollow's most prominent citizen. But as mourners filed past the casket, Eleanor felt no grief, only a strange numbness. Her father had been the architect of so much suffering. His death solved some problems but created others. Who would run the mill now? Who would make decisions about the family's future? The will was read a week later. William had left the mill and the estate to Margaret, with provisions that everything would pass to James when he came of age. But there was one final provision that made everyone in the lawyer's office fall silent. "It is my wish," the lawyer read, "that my children continue the family tradition, as I have outlined in my private papers. This tradition has ensured our prosperity for 2 centuries and must be maintained for future generations." Even from beyond death, William sought to control them. But Margaret, reading the will herself later, made a decision that would have enraged her husband. She called Eleanor and James to the study and closed the door. "I'm selling the mill," she said simply, "and I'm ending the tradition." The children stared at her in shock. Margaret, who had always seemed so weak, so powerless, now stood straight and determined. "Your father is dead. I will not let his cruelty continue. We have enough money invested elsewhere to live comfortably without the mill. We don't need this town's respect or fear. We need to heal." "Mother," Eleanor whispered, hardly daring to hope, "you believe us?" "I've always known something was deeply wrong, but I was too afraid of your father to act, too afraid of losing everything we had." Margaret's voice broke. "I let him hurt you both. I let tradition matter more than my children. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. So terribly sorry." James crossed the room and embraced his mother, and after a moment, Eleanor joined them. They stood together, 3 damaged people beginning to understand what recovery might look like. But ending the tradition for themselves was only the first step. Eleanor's promise to the dead children required more. Over the next months, as Margaret negotiated the sale of the mill and the family prepared to leave Briar Hollow, Eleanor worked with Catherine to compile everything they had learned into a comprehensive document. They titled it "The Truth About the Thornwood Tradition" and made multiple copies. One went to Dr. Harrison, who read it with growing horror and immediately began advocating for reforms in how the town's prominent families treated their children. Another went to the Boston Globe, where a sympathetic journalist found the story too compelling to ignore. The article was published in November 1896 with the headline "Child Abuse Hidden Behind Massachusetts Family's Tradition." It did not use the Thornwood name directly, but everyone in Briar Hollow knew. The scandal was enormous. Other families who had similar practices were exposed. Authorities began investigating. Some townspeople defended the old ways, argued that outsiders did not understand their customs, but many more, especially mothers who had watched their own children suffer, felt relief that someone had finally spoken truth to power. The silence had been broken. Eleanor and her family moved to Boston in December. Margaret sold the Thornwood estate to a businessman from New York who turned it into a sanitarium, ironically enough, a place for healing rather than harm. The mausoleum was emptied, the bodies properly reburied in a public cemetery, with individual headstones bearing every name Eleanor could remember. On the day they laid Charlotte Thornwood to rest with a proper marker, Eleanor placed flowers on the grave and whispered, "I kept my promise." James recovered slowly but steadily. Away from Briar Hollow, away from the weight of family expectation, he began to rediscover who he had been before the tradition damaged him. He would never be entirely whole again. Trauma leaves permanent marks. But he learned to live with his scars, to find joy despite them. Eleanor grew into a remarkable woman. She never married, never had children, keeping the promise she had made to herself. Instead, she became an advocate for children's rights, traveling across New England to speak about the dangers of harmful family traditions. She wrote books, gave lectures, worked with legislators to create laws protecting children from abuse disguised as custom. Catherine remained her closest friend and collaborator. Together, they founded an organization dedicated to helping families break cycles of generational trauma. They saved countless children from fates similar to what the Thornwood children had endured. On Eleanor's 21st birthday in 1910, she returned to Briar Hollow for the first time since her family had left. The town had changed. The mill was under new ownership, run by managers who treated workers fairly. The old families who had clung to harmful traditions had either reformed or faded into obscurity. A new generation was growing up free from the weight of the past. Eleanor walked up the hill to the cemetery where the Thornwood dead were buried. She visited each grave, remembering the stories she had heard that terrible night. Charlotte and Thomas, Rebecca and Ruth, Marcus and all the others. At the last grave, she knelt in the grass. "I did it," she said quietly. "It took years, but I did what I promised. The tradition is over. The cycle is broken. You can rest now." The wind rustled through the trees, and for just a moment, Eleanor thought she heard voices, young voices, happy and free, saying thank you. Perhaps it was her imagination. Perhaps it was real. It did not matter. What mattered was that she had kept her promise, had turned her trauma into action, her fear into courage. Eleanor Thornwood lived to be 93 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1979, having spent her long life fighting for children who could not fight for themselves. Her obituary mentioned her advocacy work, her groundbreaking books, her tireless efforts to change laws and attitudes. It did not mention the night that had changed her, the mausoleum and the dead children and the promises made in darkness. But those who knew her best understood that everything she accomplished stemmed from that one terrible night when she was 7 years old, when she learned that survival is not enough, that bearing witness matters, that one person who refuses to be silent can change everything. The Thornwood tradition died with William in 1896, but Eleanor's tradition of speaking truth, of protecting the vulnerable, of turning pain into purpose, that tradition lived on, passing from generation to generation, a legacy of light born from darkness. In the end, that is what Eleanor Thornwood proved, that children locked in tombs can emerge as warriors, that family curses can be broken, that the dead can rest when the living finally tell the truth, and that sometimes the bravest thing a 7-year-old girl can do is refuse to let her fear define her future, choosing instead to rewrite the story entirely. The mausoleum on the hill in Briar Hollow still stands, though it has been empty for over a century. Local historians preserved it as a reminder of a darker time, a memorial to all the children who suffered there. On the door, someone placed a plaque that reads simply, "In memory of those who had no voice, may we never forget, may we never repeat." And every year on the anniversary of that night in April 1896, someone leaves fresh flowers at the graves of the Thornwood children. No one knows who does it. Perhaps it is Eleanor's ghost keeping vigil. Perhaps it is someone who read her books and understood the message. Perhaps it is simply a reminder that some promises transcend death, that some debts of honor are never fully paid, only honored with faithfulness through the generations. The tradition ended, but the truth endures, and that, Eleanor would say if she could, makes all the difference. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.